been a long time revenue manager in the space, and now I get the opportunity to mostly just train and talk strategy with folks all over the country and all over the world. So pretty fun. I'm going to do 1 minute of product stuff here on my screen, and then we'll move past it. I'm going to show you a bunch of data in Wheelhouse today. A lot of this data is going to be freely available for anyone. So whether you're a Wheelhouse customer or not, you can access all of the market report data. Depending on how much time we have, this is a pretty broad area, so we may not have a ton of time, but we do have more neighborhood data in our sets tool. We may access some of that if we need to. And then I won't use this today, but we will talk a lot about pace and things like that. And we do have some tools that are available to you if you don't have great tools to see your own pacing and kind of like how you're doing year over year and stuff like that. All of our performance insights are now free. And so if you're looking for some additional tools to kind of quickly dive in and see things like pickup, same time last year pickup, where you were, those kind of comparisons, all those tools are actually free from Wheelhouse now too. So that's enough about the product. Um, let's kind of dive into some data. So I have a few things pulled up. I have a few of these market reports for some of the areas around the Panhandle. Um, but before I jump in, I do want to kind of ask you guys quickly, what what is your kind of assessment on things around the year this year? Like how have things been going in your portfolio? You can kind of segment that into like summer, that kind of stuff. I'm curious, like basically how things have been going recently for you guys, from your opinion in your own portfolios.
John, it's Thomas. Well, spring was definitely a challenge. I mean, I think pretty much everyone felt it in spring, whether you're in Miramar or Panama City Beach. We pretty much saw it everywhere that we operate. And then, of course, summer was pacing along, comparable to last year. Really, ADR has been the challenge this year. Shorter length of stay and very last minute bookings. The booking window just continues to get further and further compressed year after year. I feel like, and fall seems to be pacing all right, but it's like other things, where everything seems to be pacing fine, and then all of a sudden it's not. So, we're still waiting and seeing what's going to truly happen with fall versus projecting it.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Fall will be a kind of an interesting conversation this year, I think. But shorter booking windows, ADR is the problem. Definitely some volatility in the occupancy and some differences to spring to summer. I think those cover a lot of what I've been seeing. Thank you, Thomas. Anyone else want to share what they're seeing on their side? Something similar, something different?
All those trends are very similar to what we've seen as well. Shifting of holidays like spring break, that was the big one for springtime, the movement from March to April. And so March just was a lot more last minute than what we typically would see. Decent summer. The summer was strong, but it was more last minute for our peak periods. So, like you said, shorter booking windows. Some lessons learned for us. And fall is still pacing relatively ahead. We're starting to see a lull company wide in September, particularly the last 2 weeks. I know with kids going back to school. So just heavy focus on the remainder of the year. But September in particular, I was curious if others are. I see it in the market when looking at key data. So I think it is kind of a market trend, but curious if others are keeping a close eye on that month.
Definitely, definitely makes sense there. I'll have some thoughts when we get into September a little bit. I can tell you a little bit more. I was talking to some folks in on the Alabama side. Some pretty big folks that have access to really sophisticated search data because their portfolio is very large. And they were talking to me this last week about pretty much the a big lull in September, and I've heard that from also another large organization across the Panhandle. I think they have mostly in like Panama City with some in Destin and Navarre, and they saw a pretty big drop off for September. Like pretty much all through the summer, they're like fall is pacing really well, and then
Yeah.
suddenly the last few weeks they're like fall's not pacing well. And we were looking more closely, and it was like it's really that September stopped pacing well. Their early October is still looking really really strong. And they were concerned because they're like, we already felt like the rate was as low as we wanted to go here and that we were being really conservative, but it seems like it's totally dropped off.
Yep.
Um, we've also noticed this is a trend I've talked to a lot of revenue managers about almost for 2 years now, and it's just been kind of growing, but they've been calling it the missing middle, where like that middle part of the booking window has kind of really fallen off for folks. So we have like early booking seems to still be pretty strong in most places, and last minute bookings obviously very strong, but at the expense of a lot of ADR. And then we're kind of missing that like what used to be almost like your peak time to book. Um, and I think part of that is there's a lot of like there's no silver bullet there. I don't know exactly what it is. I think part of it is actually pricing strategy in the markets. Something I've seen kind of consistent across the country still in our industry is that despite occupancy pressures, the market as a whole tends to price a little higher, and drop in almost too short of a time. Part of it, I think, is just changing. Some of it is changing consumer sentiment, like consumer behavior. And then some of it, I think, is just instability, right, in the market. People are not planning as far out. And we're in the time in September now where a lot of people, either like those cancellation policies are closing up, for like a short period where like people have to book, so they're going to wait till shorter, I think now. And also like that you require more money up front. Once you get within like 30 days, like that's most of September now, people have to pay in full. And that was something that I think on our last revenue management roundtable, Brett Robinson's Bryant was talking about, is they've noticed every time they start to hit this, pay in full time period, their pacing drops off significantly. So kind of indicating that the consumer, like, they really do need the price to be lower because they just don't necessarily have the money to commit to. Um, when they want to travel is maybe an indicator there. And I'm wondering if that's like where this September slowdown is also occurring. We're hitting this time period where now people are going from, oh, I can put a deposit down to I got to pay in full for much larger parts of the inventory that's available. That's a little bit of an unknown. I think that makes sense a little more on the Panhandle where you guys have more developed and established distribution channels. I don't see the same feedback from not so much regions, but like property managers that are obviously all on Airbnb because those require payment in full anyway. So if their whole portfolio is like that, they're not quite seeing the same trend. But I do hear it from really large revenue manager or really large property managers who, tend to have a much more robust distribution mix. And so I think there is something there. And the indicator there is not necessarily like you have to change your policies, but it's actually just that the consumer that we're selling to may be very compressed in terms of what they can afford. Because we see these kind of like changes. So those are my hunches about what's going on there. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys or you maybe agree or disagree.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Good. I was looking for some validation, Carmen. I'm glad you
Yeah.
picked it.
We've been kicking around ideas about that. So yeah, we were kind of on the same mindset.
Yeah. Awesome. Anyone else want to share some of their observations if there's anything they've observed or think is kind of novel or seen in their portfolio that's been a little different than what Thomas and Carmen shared? Um, all right. Well, feel
Sorry,
free to
couldn't
chime
hit the
in.
unmute fast enough, John. Sorry. I've been really trying to make sense of September because, maybe I'm the only one here that's not on your pricing platform, but I've been looking at you guys. But beyond pricing, dump my pricing for September, and I'm pretty much bottomed out. Hitting my mins in a good part of the month. Obviously, less Labor Day. Kind of that little blip there, but. Which September is always soft in our market. We know that, and we feel it a lot more last minute. In Panama City Beach in particular, I feel like used to have a lot more weekend events in September that would really bolster our occupancy. And I don't think they're doing a whole lot this year. Not like bigger events like we had maybe pre-COVID stuff. But just looking at market and key data, for instance, and I know some of these data sources are different. It's only the market's only looking about 7% behind last year. And I mean, I know 7%, 7%, but it's like it doesn't look like it's like terrible. It just looks like it's a little behind. Um, like I said, we're a little behind. We're not much behind, but I've been pushing. I've been working it really hard, So I mean, does everybody else just like totally see September is dead? I mean, the data doesn't show me it's like totally dead, but also like I'm just trying to understand if maybe the data I'm looking at is not right. You know what I mean?
Um, I'll let other people chime in if they want to as well. My opinion on this is I don't think September's dead. It seems to be trailing. We'll pull up some of the data in some of these markets. I don't think the data is wrong, but you do get different slices. One, I don't know too much about Beyond's data, um, but they probably have a decent amount. We have a lot of direct data. Key data I think is very good, but they tend to give you a view of professionals. And one thing I have noticed pretty consistently is in these environments where markets are under pressure, the markets tend to be much like the professionals are maintaining market share much better than everyone else. So you, as professionals, you guys tend to be taking market share from like the non-professionals and the smaller property managers in these environments under pressure. So you guys tend to be doing much better or like maintaining, especially on the occupancy side, much better than like the market at large is. Um, I'll talk to you a little bit about pacing. I don't think things are down as much as they can be. And this is the one of the things that I think nobody's really able to model is there is this last minute push that's been occurring where like some of the like occupancies do kind of catch up in a way in the very last minute. Not always all the way, but that I think is something that we don't know how to model. We don't know how to model these changes to the booking window. We can estimate them for like pricing software, um, but that's like where your own kind of strategy has to come in because it does look like there's these slowdowns and how the market responds to that, it's unknown like where it's actually going to equalize. So I don't think that the data is wrong. Um, I do think September, at least in the Panhandle, seems to be down, but my hunch is that we're going to see a lot of very short minute booking, like last minute booking, and it'll kind of like get a little closer on the occupancy side, probably at the expense of ADR. Um, and my own opinion on that is really that I think that really comes from like people's budgets and a little bit of like the kind of like instability for planning ahead. Since it's not a super high season, people are just going to kind of wait to pay. They'll still probably make the trips. I had also heard your guys' weather hasn't been very good towards like the beginning of August, mid-August, has it? I know on the Alabama side, the weather hasn't been very good either.
Weather's been all right, but that's another thing that we hear from guests is they're just kind of like, there's that big hurricane out there that isn't coming, but like who knows what's coming next. And I know there's a lot of people that are, they're apprehensive to book too far out for the month of September. October is typically a little more active for us, I think, from a hurricane perspective. But there's also, fall break and there's just pressure for people to just get it done, to get something, booked. September is more of like a dual income, no kids, or weekend warriors, um, or parents with young kids, but people that are in traditional school, they're not traveling in September, which is one of the reasons why it's so soft. But yeah, for hurricanes, I mean, people are thinking about that too. I don't know if it's moving the needle a lot, but we're hearing it from guests. People are like, just wait a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excuses for people to just wait on booking, um, in general. And just so you guys know, like the other areas of the country that we've been doing these kind of data deep dive town halls, it's kind of helpful because it gives me kind of a sense of what's been going on. Um, the Panhandle seems to have been much more stabilized this summer. So than some of the other areas I've looked at, right? I think part of it is people across the Panhandle tend to be more sophisticated from a revenue management perspective. But after that kind of like spring panic where, pretty big shortfalls, honestly, in a way, when we look at the data, it recovered fairly quickly. April did make up for a lot of revenue. We still saw a little bit of a shortfall through parts of the spring into early summer, but then that summer occupancy was kind of able to maintain, especially among kind of professionals. Even if it was at the expense of a little ADR, that's not always the story everywhere. So there are some drops, kind of across the country. Like when we look in the Northeast, just really difficult summer there. they're missing big chunks of occupancy. And kind of the more north you go, the more that kind of like stabilization story disappears and mitigates. Um, but across the Panhandle, across parts of Florida, uh, across Alabama, Texas, we do see more stabilization this summer. So there is potentially just like pressure on the consumer side because it's not like everyone really recovered. Um, so I think there's just some mixed trends there. Like there is obviously pressure on the occupancy. The consumer is making choices about like traveling or not traveling differently than they did last year. Most places still seem to be growing a little bit in gross demand, so we probably have a supply. Supply is part of this equation. That one comes up a lot on the Alabama side, where they're not really retracting in demand, and that seems to be true across most of these panhandle markets too. Demand isn't dropping, but it's not, we've had multiple years of very large expansion of supply. Um, that tends to outpace demand. That still seems to be a little bit of the story, although supply does seem to be settling down across a lot of markets. I remember, so I was at the VRMA Executive Summit on a panel with Key Data and AirDNA, and they were reporting a little bit on supply, and AirDNA was saying that supply seems to have leveled out in a number of markets across the Panhandle. Um, so that trend might start to switch. But my thought here is the shoulder seasons, I think, are still going to be under a lot of pressure. People still have high sentiment to want to travel. Um, they will make the choice to travel, but I think it's really going to be contingent on their budget and and kind of opportunity. So it's just, you know, it means a very competitive environment, and I think we're really going to see that in the shoulder seasons, and then we're already starting to see it in the September period. But I don't really have an explanation for this kind of missing middle. That's a really soft thing where like, you know, really it comes down to what are the strategies we can do to try to drive in this kind of missing middle time period because I don't really think it's very comfortable for people to have to wait till like the last 7 days as we go through September to try to book everything in their portfolio. Has anyone had any strategies that's really been working for them to try to drive booking in September as they've seen this slowdown?
Not sure we want to share those, John.
Fair enough. I understand that. Um, I understand that. I did share some of what I've talked to from some other folks where they're really looking at the way that their deposit policy is coming into play. When I talked to my friends over at Best Beach, we were talking about like they didn't have a lot of concern for the smaller stuff. Like the more condo inventory, like seemed more acceptable that that could come in like last minute. Their bigger concern was like these homes that they have, where hey, if they're open now, like it's going to be really hard to book them in the last minute. And I think their kind of strategy was actually just to really, really focus on October, like trying to maximize their performance in October to make up for kind of the unknowns over September. And I think that's a pretty reasonable approach because, we're 40 days to the end of September. At the end of the day, like you could spend a lot of your revenue management time trying to figure out if, very negligible changes on the ADR that may or may not come in on occupancy. And I would probably suggest if you have limited time for revenue management to kind of just like, hey, just focus on getting the heads in the beds. Don't spend a ton of time playing with the rate in September. Just get the heads in. That means I used to call it do Civil War surgery. Just drop the rate, but actually focus on optimizing October because we have time. The pacing in October seems to be stronger, and that's where you might actually be able to capitalize on ADR, and it would be worth the time to do so and potentially make up for any shortfalls. And then again, something I always recommend with portfolios is as we slip back into the kind of like shoulder low season post fall break really just try to optimize ADR early. One of the trends I've seen consistently in our industry across markets is that the market at large is still pricing premiums in advance. I think that part of that is a relic of just like strategies that existed in COVID where everyone kept their rates high. I think part of it is actually time. Like property managers who don't have professional revenue managers usually don't have the time to be looking out one or two extra seasons. And so those rates just seem really, really high. compared to the occupancy pressure we know people are under. And that means there's opportunity for people to try to take market share out there if you're not, if you spend a little time to make sure that rate is kind of in line. Okay, well, let's hop into a little bit of market data. So I'm going to go through a few of the market reports, and we'll kind of start with just a high level. We'll go through some of the occupancy situations across them. I've got Destin, Santa Rosa Beach, um, Panama City, and Fort Walton, Okaloosa. I told our team to name it Okaloosa instead, but they picked the first part of the sentence instead of the second part. You can see that even though we have Fort Walton in here, there's like almost no listings in there. The zip codes have to be included. So really, this is mostly like Fort Walton Beach and Okaloosa Island. And then if you have another market area that you want me to cover, I can pull that up as well. Destin does include Miramar in our market report. And just a quick reminder, these are free. So if you do ever need to just kind of like want another source of data to supplement whatever other data sources you're using, you can access any market report in the world, whether or not you're a Wheelhouse client. In addition to that, just in terms of data source, uh, Wheelhouse market reports are going to give you a view of like the entirety of the market. So where key data is really giving you benchmarking against other professional revenue managers who are opted in, which is really excellent data because that's probably who you're most competing with directly. This is going to give us an idea of the general market. We're tracking every listing in the market. It does include all of the Wheelhouse direct data, of which we have a pretty big depth now. Particularly across the Panhandle. We obviously work with a number of large organizations in the area. Um, and we do also include all of the kind of like front end listings from Airbnb and VRBO. And Booking.com isn't in here, but we do have some of that data as well. I don't think we've made the decision not to include too much of that in the market data because it's not as important of a channel in the United States. And the way people price on it is a little different. I'm going to hop over here to this trend section. Let me grab a pen. Can you all see this little drawing?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And I'm just going to run through these real quick and kind of stick on this occupancy view. The occupancy view, I think, it's where there's kind of two views here that I really like to stick on when I'm looking at just like high level trends to kind of set strategy. Adjusted occupancy, because occupancy is obviously a pretty good kind of indicator for demand. It's like, what is the consumer actually doing? Is there enough business to go around? The other one I like to kind of focus on is asking rate. Asking rate is the averages of how people are pricing in the market. So it's a little different than ADR, which is like what people are booking. Asking rate is what people are advertising. And I think that's always an interesting one, particularly when we look at the market as a whole rather than just professionals, because it does show where some of these potential opportunities are. And I think one of the things that's interesting for you guys is not just looking at your market area. One of the things that I have a hunch is happening as part of this kind of like, especially in shoulder seasons, is people express the desire to travel, but I think they're much more flexible about where they're willing to go. Um, which means market areas, especially market areas where drive-in is your primary kind of like, that's where the business is coming from in the time period, those drive-in markets are competing with each other much more than I think they have in the past. And there was some data posted on the Panama City CVB that I went through over the summer with the last time we did one of these town halls that I thought was really interesting. They update it periodically. Um, that was just going through consumer sentiment, and it was very interesting to me how they ask a question which is like, what is your favorite beaches to go to? And how different it was between like spring and summer. And to me, that really, really indicated that people are very willing to go other places. And as we see slight differences in the kind of like demand situation, those how those market areas react to those with price can impact you, right? Like if Santa Rosa Beach is trailing in occupancy and suddenly starts to drop their rates, you can see that impact your own pacing and demand. Now, it's very hard to like draw the line, but I think it's pretty important to be aware of what some of these other market areas around you are doing as well, because they are potentially competing with you for these drive-in customers, especially in these shoulder periods, in my opinion. So kind of first thing to note here is the general story we have that we've been talking about seems to be pretty supported in this data, right? We see shortfalls in Q1. Little bit of that's made up in April. We see those shortfall kind of continue in May, although across Destin and Miramar, that May occupancy still maintained pretty well. And then we see pretty decent stabilization. In fact, at the market level across all listings in the market, we see a slight increase in occupancy. So summer kind of recovering from an occupancy perspective, meaning there are enough customers to kind of go around. Now, as we get into the rest of the year, um, August, we're almost done with August. We got 10 days left. To me, this looks like this is going to be pretty tight. Like we have a lot on the books here. Uh, we need to get a little more than 10% on the books with 10 days left. It's possible that that could happen, although that very end of August tends to be a little weak. However, the way that Labor Day is situated this year, it could be very reasonable that this maintains. I did pull up pacing information for you guys for these future months, so I'll read that off for you. It's not very obvious on this chart. I did use our data to get there to get to an estimate of it. But um, at the market level, around this time last year, we were at about 39% occupancy. And so actually starting to pull a little bit of ahead at the total market level for August, which looks pretty good. But that situation switches as we get into September. September is trailing a little bit, um, about -3%. And that kind of continues as we go out. So we're still seeing a little bit of a trail in the pace, um, kind of going out at the market level. Um, in my opinion, that trailing is not a super huge amount, right? And this is a market, we'll go into this, that's a little interesting, where in this Destin Miramar area, the October is trailing more than some of the other market areas I pulled up. In most of the market areas, September tends to be trailing quite a bit. And then October is either trailing only a little bit, like marginally, like within a margin of error almost, or not at all. But in the Destin Miramar one, we're starting to see a little bit of that trailing. And so that's something to keep in mind, right? Is that we may start to see adjustments to this that can impact your own pacing in your market. And some of this may be the kind of unit mix itself, right? We know some of these areas have different kinds of like property tiers, property sizes that may be feeling that impact a little bit. Um, so in general, that story we've been talking about is kind of supported in the Destin data. I think that even though we're trailing a little bit here in September, we're probably on track to hit 50% of what was on the books last year by the time we start the month. And to me, that's like, this is a heuristic, but that would be like not a full panic heuristic. So while people are saying like, hey, September's not looking as good, I think that the way people are expressing that is not near like the panic that we saw in response to kind of shortfalls in March, right? Um, it's more of a like, and this is, take this with a grain of salt, but it's more like, bummer. After like kind of seeming to recover like occupancy pace, it seems like it's slipping back a little bit, right? Um, and I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that shoulder seasons are going to be under a lot of pressure and also very, very last minute. That last minute kind of nature, I think, is really visible in August, where we're actually starting to see that pacing switch. And so we might be able to carry that forward. I don't think that it's going to give a lot of confidence to kind of like raise rate or keep a higher rate position, but it may give some confidence that September may actually end up, despite kind of like early pacing shortfall, kind of in line and a little bit more stabilized, because we see in August that, when we looked at this at the beginning of the summer, August was pacing behind. So while we were stabilizing here in June and July, August was behind. Now, 3/4 or 2/3 of the way through August, we're actually starting to pull a little ahead on the occupancy pace, probably at the expense of ADR. And we probably, I think it would be safe to maybe hold that in your mind that that could occur for September too, is that even though we're seeing this lull where the middle booking window kind of dries up, we'll probably see a lot of in the week for the week booking. Now, one thing I do want to ask you guys quickly um, Is anyone still holding restrictions out here in September as of right now? And if you have held restrictions in September in the past, like minimum length of stay or any kind of check-in, check-out restriction, when have you guys been coming off those, or have you already pretty much abandoned them or not really ever held them for that shoulder?
It depends on the product mix for us. So we've gotten more flexible and off beach, but kind of holding out for our premium inventory.
Makes sense.
We don't have any stay restrictions in September outside of summer. I've kind of abandoned stay restrictions other than, basic 3-night minimums, as of really the last, I guess 23, we really started flexing on that pretty good. Any property types that we have, condos or homes or townhomes that are 3 bedrooms or smaller, condos 2 bedrooms or smaller, kind of depends on the condo. Some 3 bedrooms I'll hold it, but I've abandoned booking restrictions, nightly minimum restrictions, stuff like that for summer as well. Just, I mean, Jim at Best Beach, him and I have lunch from time to time, and we kind of both did the same thing. I guess back in 23, just kind of dropped all that. I have some owners that push back on it, but short of our, 6, 7 bedroom Gulf Run homes, in summer, even those guys, I dropped the minimums 90 days, 120 days out for summer, just to fill in. But that's kind of how we run.
That makes sense. I think the Panhandle and really the whole Gulf Coast is at the forefront of, for lack of a better term, I don't think this is a negative. I actually think it's a very responsive kind of like a sophistication of revenue management, but overall the erosion of restrictions has really, you know, the Gulf markets are at the forefront of that. We're seeing across, like, as you go up into the Carolina coast and Georgia coast, this year is like the first year where they're really realizing they need to start coming off of these restrictions. And so I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of years that's like it's like a memory that people used to do Saturday to Saturday like consistently and be able to fill their calendars with long kind of stays like that.
I think the industry as a whole is it's moving away from that completely. I think you're right. In a few years, it'll be total relic of the past. I'll tell you what I'd like to see some software companies do is more of a dynamic cancellation policy, because, VRBO and Airbnb, they're constantly pressuring us to make our cancellation policy a lot more flexible, which honestly I'm more than willing to do like 10 months out of the year, but I won't do it during summer. I can't change my cancellation. I mean, summer 30-day cancellations for our big properties is like it's undoable. We
Yeah.
just work with it. But in September, I mean, I'd do a 2-week cancellation, you know what I mean? Like in my shoulder seasons or winter, like I don't really care. But there's no as far as I know right now, at least Escapia doesn't. There's no software that enables you to have cancellation periods that are kind of dynamic in that regard.
Yeah, the limitation is really the OTAs. And I think it's funny. A couple of years ago, I was talking to the folks at Wimstay. I really like Alex Alito and their team's nice, but I was telling them like, they were talking to us, they were asking me questions about like what they should do. I was like, well, the last minute rate is great, but all revenue managers are doing that anyway. So it's not really any different than like what we're going to do. We're not offering you anything special. Like what you really should be doing is letting us offer different cancellation policies. Um, yeah, I don't know that they picked that up. And interestingly, I think I'm very curious, and this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, so I won't go too far, but the recent changes to Airbnb's policies around like payment and stuff like that, they seem to be moving in the opposite direction, which I think makes sense because the consumer wants that. But I think we'll see, like you said, large homes and stuff that really luxury, either luxury or large home. Um, I'm wondering if that inventory, if property managers are really going to have to drive sales outside of Airbnb for that. I think a lot of already do, but being kind of shoehorned into really flexible cancellation policies, I think is we may see. I'm curious if we'll see like some of that inventory start to disappear from Airbnb, except for in the last minute, right? Almost using your inventory controls to kind of keep people from buying off that, or using pricing itself through like premiums. One of the things I do think that would be helpful is A lot of people have channel markups, but people really need to be able to set those channel markups on conditions, right? Like if you're far in the future on Airbnb, you want to mark up, but you don't necessarily want it in the short term. People want to mark up their summer, but not necessarily their low season. Not many PMSs have built the capability to do that, and I think that's something that's really going to become more necessary, especially if Airbnb pushes on some of these policies. Um, well, let's come back to the data real quick. I do want to pull up just a glance at some of these asking rate situations. So just a reminder, asking rates are the kind of average rates that people are posting. So it's not necessarily what's being sold. It's a mix of both what's sold and also left open. And in it, we can kind of see how the market is responding to the demand situation from the adjusted occupancy side. And so looking at this, the one thing that kind of sticks out is as a market, not actually seeing too much premium year over year. We do see a little bit, which I think makes sense. We're always going to see probably a little bit of growth in the way people are doing pricing. But across Destin, we're not seeing rates get pushed too high across the market as a whole. There is still a little bit of a premium. But once we get into September and October, you do start to see that kind of pump up a little bit. So we see this trend that I think is pretty consistent across our industry, where once you get outside of 30 days, sometimes outside of 60 days, usually definitely outside of 90 days, market rates start crawling up, right? That tends to be different than what professional property managers are doing. Professional property managers tend to look out much further. And sometimes we can see that if we look at like just the highest performing listings. If we look at those, you can see. So this is like the top 20% of listings in Destin Miramar. Their posted pricing situation is much more conservative all the way through October compared to where it was last year. Whereas the market as a whole, you see that there's still premiums out here. And to me, that kind of indicates when we look at market pacing and we see areas trailing a little bit, and in this case, we're seeing in Destin, October, September, and November are trailing a little bit. Um, I have a hunch that that doesn't necessarily mean the consumer isn't there. It does sometimes mean that the market itself isn't always super optimized. Now, in the Panhandle, people tend to be much more sophisticated on the revenue management. That's where I think you see this like much more conservative, high performing group where people really are adjusting rate and really trying to push into this fall time period for bookings now. When we go further north into the Carolina coast and especially into the Northeast, you just don't see that even among the top performers. They're really having a hard time responding to changes in the demand situation. Um, and maybe they'll learn over time. I think you guys have a lot more established revenue management practices. Um, but those high performers are already shifting and revenue managing and trying to drive occupancy, really focusing on driving occupancy further out. But um, it doesn't match the market as a whole. The market as a whole is still holding on to a little bit of these premiums, and I think this is an opportunity for you guys, especially if you can find the time to look further out. And that goes into that kind of advice I said before, which is, don't just focus on October and September right now with all your revenue management time. It's really October where you're probably going to be able to get the most juice for your squeeze and potentially some opportunities in November, because even though these aren't high occupancy time periods, taking any market share now can be really valuable for kind of bolstering what happens when we hit that, like one, when we hit the missing middle, so we kind of dry up booking, and then two, it like leaves you less properties you have to just compete with the last minute, where honestly you're probably going to be at the bottom of the barrel rate anyway. So why not, if you're holding any premiums, like why hold them? Because you're kind of just telling the consumer like, hey, not right now for this property. um Okay, let's hop over to Santa Rosa Beach, and we'll just take a quick look at these markets real quick here. Um, General story is going to be the same, although something that has been unique to me, I think, looking at Santa Rosa Beach in general, is that most of the year hasn't seen the same occupancy pressure that other areas of the Panhandle have seen. I don't know why. Um, when I was looking at some data for the executive conference, I did see that it seemed like Santa Rosa Beach property managers were adjusting rates much earlier than other people. Like they were going down further from their strategies, they were doing it much earlier. And we see a lot more stabilization of occupancy here. Pretty much every month across the board is even or slightly above last year. Now they seem to have a much bigger drop off Sorry, let me take that back. I was thinking that August was up here on Destin, but it's not. But that was pretty stabilized. They're in a pretty good position here. Little more than 10% to go for August. And in terms of the pacing situation, August is about right on. So they're not quite pulling ahead. So oddly see a little bit of a reversal. So where Destin was under a lot more pressure through the beginning of the year, but starting to pace a little better in August, we see in Santa Rosa that they've been under a little less occupancy pressure. Their pacing is not quite as good for August, but still a little bit ahead. But they actually have a much bigger shortfall when we get to September. They're down about 6%. So that is very similar to that 7% you were looking at, Jason. We still see a little bit of a trailing in October and about the same trailing in November. So that shortfall is even showing up in a market that has seemed to be much more stable from an occupancy perspective than some of the other markets in the Panhandle. From the rate side, one thing to note here is I did mention that when I looked at this with people on our town hall in the summer, Santa Rosa Beach tended to be much more conservative from a rate position. We do see that market as a whole is usually down a little bit from last year in the way that they were advertising rates. So you see some of that conservativeness. But as we get into August and beyond, we do start to see these rate premiums show up again. And even still holding a little bit in August where we see less of occupancy pace than Destin. And so this is kind of interesting to me. I'm curious if maybe this market has gotten a little bit optimistic because they've been able to maintain their occupancy kind of demand situation, or maybe even take market share from other markets through most of the year. And where other markets are being more conservative around them, they're maybe holding a little bit and losing some of the ground that they've had in previous months. This September shortfall, I think the market is not doing a great job of responding to it in Santa Rosa Beach because they're still holding somewhat high premiums at the market level, despite the fact that of all the markets I kind of pulled up, their September pacing is actually some of the worst. And when we look at the highest performing listings, we do see a similar trend in that these highest performers are adjusting a little bit further out. August doesn't hold any premium, but they still have a little premium here in September, October. So there's almost a little bit of a reversal where they had been more conservative through most of the year and actually been able to maintain their occupancy. The market and the high performers in the market don't seem to be quite as conservative going forward, and it does seem to be punishing them a little bit. And I think, I have no way to attribute this, but people who are looking to go here are probably looking at all the other beaches. And if you see those differences in response and strategy, you can very quickly potentially see changes to, who's actually performing and who's not. I'll stop there for a second if anyone wants to kind of pop in or make a comment about Santa Rosa Beach. I know, Carmen, you have a lot of properties across different beaches. If you have any thoughts on like how different beaches are acting and why that might be, I'd love it if you want to chime in. I see you went off mute, but I can't hear
Oh, sorry.
you.
No, I don't think I have any notes for that one. Sorry.
No problem. Um, let's pull up Panama City here. So Panama City, I'll go through these pretty quick because the trends aren't going to be too different. That general story we talked about is pretty good. Occupancy for the summer in Panama City looking really strong, actually, especially July, right? Seeing a pretty significant occupancy increase across the board. We've heard you mention that, and this is pretty true for most of the revenue managers I've talked about. Maintaining occupancy is great, usually happening at the expense of ADR here. So people aren't necessarily maintaining the ADRs they had last year, but they're definitely able to maintain that occupancy. And Panama City is probably looking the best in terms of summer occupancy, where we actually see, in some ways, a pretty significant increase into July. As we get into the upcoming months, pacing a little bit ahead here in August. So that last minute booking looking very, very strong. Potentially, if that continues, putting us above last year as well. And then a little bit of a shortfall as we get into September and October. But of all the markets that I pulled up, the pacing shortfall for September is actually the smallest here in Panama City. And then, we're about in the same situation for October, but still actually one of the smallest in terms of any kind of deficit for October. And there's a slight deficit at the market level here for October. So really kind of seeing like this area is I my hunch here is that Panama City really benefits from the last minute booking because of the inventory type. It tends to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a lot. I mean, there's obviously a lot of inventory here. This is a really large market area. And there's a lot of the smaller bedroom count condo inventory here too. So whenever we have situations where like people are kind of waiting till the last minute to book, um, that I think the least exposed are going to be your small inventory. And so you can see that they're probably taking market share from bigger homes where people like really are thinking like, hey, well, maybe I don't need a bigger property. I need it to be in the right price point. And they're able to maintain that kind of occupancy at a much better level. In terms of the asking rate situation, um, we do see that premiums start to appear at the market level here. And in a way, this is probably being rewarded a little bit, right? So rewarded in the sense where like they're maintaining this last minute occupancy. Some of these premiums aren't resulting in shortfalls, although we do still see here that there's a little bit of a mismatch. We see some pacing deviation where the pacing is down a little bit. We still see some premiums out here, and that might mean that there's some opportunities for you to try to take market share by really adjusting your rate, particularly out into September and definitely into October. Now, the downside of like where you're insulated a little bit in the short-term booking with small properties in a market like this, it's also much harder to shift the booking window though. So there may not be much you can do other than kind of like make sure your rate is right once we get within that, 14-day, 7-day period, which is a tough situation to be in as a property manager because if it doesn't come in, there's not anything you can really do about it. Looking at the high performers, we do see that they're being much, much more conservative across the board. That occupancy, this is, I think, a really interesting trend. We saw that occupancy was really increased at the market level. In the summer, we see there's increases in the high performers, and the high performers actually came off of their rates quite a bit. So the way that they were advertising was much, much more conservative. But that's a link I think that people can make for other markets, right? Because this is the only one we've seen so far that really had substantial increases on the occupancy side over the summer. So really coming down to that idea of stealing market share. And in a way, a market is stealing market share from other markets, right? And so if you're aware that this kind of last minute situation in Panama City can be really, really competitive. And if you're planning like, well, we're gonna have to compete in the last minute, you kind of want to be aware that there may be market areas that actually are competing much more strongly against you, and that may change how much you decide you actually need to drop your rate, and may also affect how far out you decide to drop your rate, even if you're not as comfortable dropping the rate yet that far out, because we know that this market nearby to you, very, very responsive on the rate, very, very willing to drop below what they were doing last year to kind of drive occupancy and take that occupancy market share. And the last one I've got pulled up here is the Fort Walton Okaloosa. And let me just click off 2023 and 2026. This is another one where we do see some pretty good occupancy growth through the summer. And so correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that when I talk to people in these areas, there tends to be a conversation around like Fort Walton Beach, and in Panama City, there's a lot of inventory that tends to be more of like consumer available. I talked to a lot of property managers that have a lot of non-luxury inventory. And I think what's interesting that sticks out to me here is these markets that have product that you might consider to be able to be offered at more of a value for the consumer seem to be maintaining a little bit better, right? They seem to be taking a little bit more market share. And to me, that is an indicator about some of these consumer conditions, is that the consumers are really looking for value and not necessarily saying like, well, hey, I'm going to splurge to get the little extra. They're saying, I'm going to take the trip, but I'm going to to find a place where I can get the value, because we're seeing these like the strongest kind of occupancy situations here in these markets that tend to have a lot of properties that are able to compete at the lower end. Um, if you have big properties, I think you have to kind of take that into account and make a hunch about like what is the consumer doing here. And my big kind of takeaway from both my last management roundtable and looking at this data is value needs to be something that you're prioritizing for the consumer. When you think about your pricing strategy and how you're driving occupancy, um, you need to be thinking, does my property offer a value? Like, not, and when I say value, I mean like a good deal, right? I think that's really important to consumers right now. Um, and if you're not pricing in a way to offer that value compared to both the market and just what people are willing to afford, you may be competing against other markets that can offer that, or against other properties that are vacant in the short term. And then it's kind of a roll of the dice that the consumer sees you. You're relying on the OTA to really push you ahead of other properties and make you visible. As we look forward into the pacing situation here, though, September is pacing pretty good. They're up a little bit. At about 2%. When we get into September and beyond, we actually see, though, uh, this has one of the larger September deficits, which is interesting. And then October is about in line with all the others. So the October situation seems pretty similar across all these, which means that that kind of early booking window trend that we've talked about, where just before the missing middle, it seems to be doing okay. We see that pretty consistent, but this September seems pretty variable in terms of where its performance is, but we do see shortfalls across the board. Everyone is pacing a little bit behind for September, um, and you know we can take that maybe with a grain of salt because everyone is pacing well in the very short term and occupancy, and so this may reverse, but it is something to kind of keep in mind and validates what we've all been saying beforehand. Now, from a rate perspective, what's interesting about Okaloosa here is we see that they are still keeping kind of premiums in the way that rates are being advertised across the board. And in a way, this has been rewarded too. So I'll be curious to see how the fall kind of comes together. I think there's an element here where some of the other markets that have been having more pressure and more shortfalls are becoming more conservative as we look out. And some of the markets that have been kind of rewarded from the occupancy perspective are becoming less conservative. So it'll be interesting when we get into October and November to see if some of these trends have switched and like Fort Walton, Okaloosa, Panama City start to be under a little bit more occupancy pressure, and we start to see a little bit of recovery in Destin and like Santa Rosa, Miramar. If those revenue managers start to become more conservative because they've been under a little bit more pressure and these guys don't react. Looking at the highest performing listings, we do see a little bit of a difference here. They're not holding the same premiums, but again, we are still seeing a little less conservative behavior in this market. So we're seeing these switches. It's like Okaloosa, Fort Walton, Panama City becoming a little less conservative, maybe, optimistic because they've been able to maintain their occupancy positions a little better at the market level. Whereas in like Destin, Miramar, Santa Rosa, a little bit more pressure, becoming a little less conservative or a little more conservative about how they're approaching the fall. But at the end of the day, that September time period, I think, is going to be the big one. It's like almost like a bellwether. How September ends up coming in the last minute, I think, is really going to determine how people start pricing the rest of the year. The one thing I think is that that's going to be a little too late for October. So when it comes down to how you're pacing in your portfolio, you kind of need to make decisions now. Like if you're pacing more than 3 or 4% behind, or sorry, 5 or 6% behind for September, or like 2 or 3% for October, you probably want to be making moves now and beat the market a little bit on pace, because I don't think rates are going to go higher. We've pretty much consistently seen that rates are dropping in the short term. And so if you have, there's just no reason to hold any kind of rate, especially if you're pacing behind. If you're pacing ahead, you can maybe make that decision, especially if you're producing bookings at those higher rates. It's maybe reasonable to hold, but you do want to make sure that you're tracking that on a really granular level, because those situations could change very rapidly. Right? We see that these pacing situations in the short term change very rapidly. We also know that the markets are in slightly different situations and have slightly different behavior. So if those markets start to change their behavior, it could really impact you know, what kind of deals the consumer can see compared to your property. Okay, well, we're at about time. Kind of went through the data in a pretty limited way, but really appreciate you guys having a great conversation with us about strategy. I wish we had a little bit time to kind of talk about what you guys are thinking for next summer as you start to set your rates. If anyone wants to comment on that, please feel free to. But otherwise, really appreciate your time, and I hope you guys found this helpful. And we'll make sure to send you the recording after this that you're welcome to watch again, or ask your team to watch, or share out with anyone you like to.
John, thanks
This
for
was
doing
great.
it for us.
No problem. No problem.
Thank,
Pleasure.
thank you, John.
Thanks, Carmen. Thanks, Thomas. We'll probably do another one of these. We hit the Panhandle quite often. Sometimes we decide to break it up into very specific markets. Sometimes we do the entire Panhandle, which, is a lot of data. We have a little less time to dig into the data, but look out for this. We'll probably do another one around fall just to see how that's wrapping up, and do one towards the end of the year to really talk about how people are strategizing for 2025. And would love to have you guys join.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.